second half of the year. But Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says people are crying out for change and is accusing him of dithering.
If he's not going to set a date, what's he hiding from the public? This has serious implications for the country because he's basically saying he's going to be squatting for months and months in Downing Street, dithering and delaying.
Well, the Labour leader will be taking your calls here on LBC with Nick Ferrari tomorrow morning. A woman's died after crashing into a tree brought down by Storm Henk near Reading. Thames Valley Police has referred itself to the police watchdog as the tree had been reported to officers around 90 minutes before the collision on Tuesday. In Nottinghamshire, a major incident's been declared because of flooding along the River Trent. Forecaster John Ketley's told us large parts of the southern half of the UK are under a yellow weather warning.
It's not a big storm in the sense that it's very windy, but it is the longevity of the band of rain, which is very slow moving, and some of it is particularly heavy as well.
Detectives investigating the death of a teenager on New Year's Eve say they believe he was stabbed in a spontaneous fight. Harry Pittman was killed on Primrose Hill in North London just before midnight on Sunday. The Met has released images of two men they want to speak to after three teenagers were released under investigation. Health trusts have been accused of fundamentally undermining a system to ask striking junior doctors to return to work. At least 20 hospitals in England have requested support on the second day of 6 days of strike action. They can do so in unexpected and extreme circumstances, but the BMA says it's not clear that criteria has been met. And Luke Littler has been offered a place in the lucrative Premier League dart competition. The 16-year-old finished runner-up in the World Championship to world number one Luke Humphreys at Alexandra Palace yesterday. Despite having not won a major title, he's been fast-tracked to become the youngest player in Premier League history. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 40 points at 77.23. The pound buys $1.26 and €1.15. LBC weather: heavy rain in southern and southeastern parts of England tonight. Rain at times for Scotland, but drier elsewhere, and lows of 0. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Hello, very good evening. It's 8:03 on LBC. We're streaming this hour live on Global Play if you'd like to watch us. And the reason we're doing that is because we're going to have a debate about a subject that I've talked about a lot on the show over the years. And it is about whether various artefacts should be returned to their country of origin. Now, the one that I suppose we talk about most is the Elgin Marbles or the Parthenon Marbles, depending on your point of view, I suppose. But there are many other things that we've talked about over the years. The Benin bronzes, all sorts of things related to Iraq as well. Sort of remember when Afghanistan was being invaded, all sorts of sort of historical artefacts were being destroyed there, and people were saying, well, we should go and get them in a sort of slightly imperialist way, I suppose, to protect them. But I think people feel very strongly about cultural artefacts, wherever they come from, and what the future of them should be. And there are some people who adopt a slightly imperialist attitude and say, well, we're not. These things should stay in this country's museums because we can look after them better than in their home countries, as if other countries don't have proper museums that are capable of looking after things. And I detect a change in mood in some ways, particularly in the argument about the Elgin/Parthenon marbles, where I think some people who would have taken a fairly traditional view on this and saying, well, they are the property of the British Museum, therefore they must always remain the property of the British Museum. I detect a little bit of a change in those attitudes. Now, we've got two people with us to talk about not just the marbles, but other things too. We have Alexander Herman, who's director of the Institute of Art and Law, who's the author of the book, The Parthenon Marbles Dispute, Heritage, Law, Politics and Restitution, the Return of Cultural Artefacts. And Tiffany Jenkins is here, a writer and cultural commentator who's the author of the book Keeping the Marbles, How the Treasures of the Past Ended Up in Museums and Why They Should Stay There. Well, if you're watching, here are the two books. Plug over. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for coming in. I mean, I've always found this debate really, really interesting, and I found it quite a difficult one because it's one of those where I can see both sides of the argument, which I never like doing really, because you always want to come down on one side or the other. But if I'm honest, Tiffany, I have slightly moved towards the view that, well, actually, okay, legally, the marbles do belong to the British Museum and to Britain, but ethically, do they?
That's the question. The question for me is answered by saying yes. I think you have to ask where is best for the object and what does the object do? Now, depending on where they are, they do different things. The Acropolis Museum in Athens is a fabulous museum where you can see half of the Parthenon sculptures, if you like, near the Acropolis itself. You can look out the window and it's beautiful. And you can see them in the context of sort of what came before it, sort of the pre-classical sculptures. That's great. In the British Museum, you can see them in relationship to other cultures. So they perform a very particular and I think fundamentally important role. They've also been there for 200 years. And in that, they've become embedded in British culture and British architecture. You know, the building itself probably partly looks like it does because of those sculptures. So I think because of the object, really, and what it can tell us about the specifics of ancient Athens and Athenian culture in relationship to other cultures, they should stay in the British Museum.
Does that apply to everything?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the argument I put in the book is for retention, but I think you do have to have a case-by-case basis, and museums can't be museums of themselves. They do move, but you always have to ask where is best for the object, but also who decides, you know, who makes these decisions? And often in these debates, claimants are presented as speaking for one nation, and it's often a little bit more complicated than that.
Alexander, let's turn to you. Now, you clearly take a different point of view. What do you disagree with what Tiffany said there?
Well, I'm not an activist or a campaigner for restitution. I'm more of a commentator, so I try to see both sides as best as I can. I'm a great fan of Tiffany's work, and I know her book very well and everything that she's had to say about this. So I have a lot of sympathy for that view. I also have a lot of sympathy for the other side, especially when it comes to the marbles. I think there's a lot to be said about reunifying the marbles. You have half of the remaining pieces in Greece, and you have half of the remaining pieces in the UK. You have a head in one country and the body in the other. Aesthetically, that doesn't really make sense. There's also a narrative sweep of the whole story that's being told on the frieze, for example, which you can't see that at the British Museum because you only get half the story. So I think there's some aesthetic arguments for reunifying the marbles in particular, and I also think that there are some ethical arguments as well. I think the ethical position for museums has changed a lot in the last 20 to 25 years. Now museums have an ethical obligation to engage with countries and communities of origin. Doesn't mean they always have to restitute items from their collections, but they at least have to have those dialogues and build those relationships. Sometimes that might lead to return. So I think that it's about relationships and building those relationships between. So I would go a bit beyond just the object, which was what Tiffany was talking about. I'd say it's about relationships as well.
And this is really important to the Greek government. We've seen the fallout between Rishi Sunak and the Greek Prime Minister over the past few weeks. Bizarre, I thought, but there we are. The Greek people seem to think this is a very important thing too. And I therefore, Tiffany, try and put myself in the position of a Greek citizen. What would I think if I was Greek? Now, if you did that, would your view change, do you think?
Well, I was in Athens in the summer and I did a debate underneath the Acropolis on this, and there were lots of Greek people in the audience who very much wanted them to return to Athens. And I can understand and appreciate that. I also speak to people in the British Museum, the audiences that go 6 to 7 million a year from all over the world, but also from Britain, from Bognor, wherever. And they also have a very strong relationship to these artefacts. So the question is, does the sort of the national a relationship override the more universal? I think maybe in some cases it does, but these objects were created 2,500 years old, 2,500 years ago. It was before Greece was a state. In fact, Britain, I think, has had them longer than Greece has been a state. So I'm not sure the national context necessarily overrides the universal.
But we weren't a state then either.
No, things change. But what I'm trying to say is this notion that one culture owns culture, their own culture, and I just think is probably a little bit fixed and essentialistic. Right, so cultures move all over, artifacts move all over, and they're influenced by all sorts of different things. If you go to the British Museum, for example, you will see all the Roman sculptures. That is influenced by the Greek sculptures. Then a lot of the Roman sculptures that were influenced by the Greek sculptures are in Italy. Culture moves. And I think it's not as static as sometimes this debate kind of presents it as.
I mean, that is true, Alexander, isn't it? In the sense that in most museums around the world, it won't just be that country's history that is being portrayed.
That's true. And I think, the British Museum is a great example of that, as are many other great museums in the UK and beyond. And I don't think that's necessarily going to be challenged if there are certain restitutions of some pieces that are maybe of some particular importance to countries of origin or communities of origin in some cases. But I do think they will be the exceptions rather than the rules. So there's no question that the museums will be emptied, which is often the argument that's used by certain people who are against restitution. The famous floodgates are we opening the floodgates? Are we allowing everything to be emptied from the museum? I don't think that's true, even in relation to the British Museum's collection.
I think the Greek culture minister, I've got the name here, Linda Mendoni, she's pledged to fill the void of the British Museum should ancient sculptures be returned to Athens, which is very kind of her, I guess. But what should there be a general rule of thumb, or does each artefact have to be treated on its own merits?
I think it would have to be on its own merits. I think a case-by-case basis, Tiffany already mentioned that, I think would be the right approach. I think there already are guardrails, there are rules and guidelines in place. We have a restitution repatriation guidance from Arts Council England that's been in place for about a year. We have codes of ethics that museums have followed for the last 20 or 25 years that talk about engaging with communities of origin, that give a sort of guidance for museums in order to determine what should be returned and what should be kept. So I think each case needs to be measured on its own merits, and as a result the museum will build that relationship with the claimants, and that might really lead to restitution in some cases.
Let's just try and establish, and I don't know if you're going to agree on this, how Lord Elgin got hold of the marbles. Did he steal them, as some claim, or was it all done legally? Who wants to start?
Well, I've looked at this. My background is legal, so I looked at the legalities of it. I don't think it's 100% convincing, but I do think on balance, Lord Elgin and his men did obtain permission from the Ottoman Empire. Now, it wasn't the Greek state. The Greek state didn't exist at the time. So I think there's some moral questions
with it. This was in, what, the 1820s?
Or a little earlier. So 1801 to 1812 was when the last shipment left. And I think there's enough documentation, especially with what's come out of the archives more recently, that shows that he did, on balance, have permission from the Ottoman authorities. But that's not the end of the story. Morally, I think there are some questions about that, because the Greeks weren't in charge, obviously, and there was some serious damage done to the building and to the pieces themselves in removing them. Every single piece of the frieze, for example, had to be sawed off of its backside to make it easier to transport, for example. It's not something any archaeologist today would ever accept. So there was a lot of, I think, ethical problems with what was done back in 1801 to 1812, even if legally it might have been permissible at the time.
No court of law would find in favour of the Greeks or against Elgin. And so that's why it's not actually a legal question. It's a moral one.
There might be some international legal issues, but whether this would ever make it to the International Court of Justice, I don't think that's much of a runner.
Get the popcorn out for that one.
I think one of the interesting questions, though, is to reflect on why now. Like why you, for example, Iain, have come to a degree more in favour of the Greeks. And I think there are two things that I think are really important. One is the way in which, sort of post-BLM, there's been this massive decolonised movement in museums. And so although it was the Ottomans who ran Greece, there's this sort of sense that we need to reckon with the British past. The second reason is this sort of uncertainty about what a museum's purpose is. And I think what you actually see and what's most interesting is that in many cases, the people who are pushing for repatriation are actually Western curators in many of the cases. And so what you have almost is like this sort of crisis of purpose within those institutions. And that's why, although I don't think there's a floodgate argument problem, I think unless museums can actually stand up for what they are, which is objects from all over the world in one place on the whole, unless they can do that, you will see the crumbling of a purpose of a museum, and that will have consequences.
But I think what Tiffany sees as a crisis, I would see as something more of an ethical move that museums have had to make over the last 20 or so years. So it depends on how you view that. And I think there are people who work in museums, including at the British Museum, who are quite favorable to, certainly to long-term loans or to, long-term transfers of pieces from the collection. We have to keep in mind 8 million items in the British Museum's collection. How many of them are on permanent display? About 1%. So there's a lot to go around.
Where are all the others in storage?
In very expensive storage, by the way. I'm surprised you haven't talked about that on your show.
Well, maybe we should. Because I mean that I think is a really interesting point, because we have all sorts of museums all around the country. Do they have access to the British Museum collection if they want to sort of put things on display?
I mean, the British Museum is a great lender of material around the world, and obviously in the UK as well. So they lend out thousands of pieces every year. So they're in a sense a great lending library to the world. They're more than that, but that's one of the roles that they have.
And they did in fact lend they didn't lend, but they sent one of the marbles to Russia, the god of Isius, under Neil MacGregor, in a sort of political act, both as a way of saying we share things, but also a way of saying we've got the marbles. We'll just let Putin look at it for a while.
We should also point out
that one hasn't aged particularly well.
Indeed. But we should also point out that even if George Osborne, who now chairs the British Museum, even if he and his board decided that they wanted to basically give them back, it's not within their power to do so, is it?
We've got the British Museum Act of 1963 that says no. I think they would also have a big PR problem on their hand. It's not a good look, politicians, and he's still a politician in our minds. It's not a brilliant look, politicians being involved in this, because it just looks self-interested.
Can you imagine the campaign that Nigel Farage would fight to keep our marbles?
Would he chain himself like a Greenpeace activist to that? That would be something to pay for.
Now, there's a thought.
I'd pay for that.
Now, we haven't talked about other things, which we will do in a moment, but I also want to come to calls as well. So if you'd like to take part in the debate, do you think that the marbles should go back to Athens, or maybe just be lent to the Acropolis? 0345 6060 973. What are the arguments for keeping them here? Now, there's a text that came in earlier. Let me see if I can find it. No name on this one. How would the panellists feel if half of Stonehenge was abroad? In Normandy, just as an example, perhaps not the fairest comparison, but there you go. It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think we've always got to try and look at it from the other country's point of view, the other people's point of view. And I don't think we would react very well if we had to try and get half of Stonehenge back from the French, for example. There lies madness. 0345 6060 973. It's 18 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Report. Iain Dale on LBC.
Alexander Herman and Tiffany Jenkins with me talking about the return or possibly not of historical artefacts. Both of them have written books. Tiffany's is called Keeping Their Marbles and Alexander's is called The Parthenon Marbles Dispute, with a very long subtitle.
So compulsory.
Let's go to a couple of calls because there are lots of things I want to talk about that we haven't yet covered. But let's talk to Shahid, who's in Manchester. Hello, Shahid.
Hi, it's actually Shazad.
I do apologise. I'll tell you why I said Shahid, because
It's okay.
I'm used to saying Shahid in Hemel Hempstead, and I thought it was him first of all.
That's okay. No, I have spoken to you in the past, but not for many years. It's an interesting debate that you're having, but I think it lacks addressing one very fundamental issue, which is that I believe personally that every single thing that is held within the British Museum is stolen goods, fundamentally, and that's the issue here. The reasoning given by Tiffany, although it sounds intellectual, when you actually break it down, it doesn't address that fundamental point, which is the British Museum has no legal validity to hold these items. And this is what sort of causes a bit of an outrage in the countries such as Greece, where you're speaking about, their wish to have, goods returned to them. And it's the same across the whole of the Indian subcontinent, Africa, all of these places where it's very clear that Britain had, this is theft. This is, for me, although this may disturb some of your, the people with you, most notably Tiffany, the British Museum is a criminal enterprise. It is holding stolen goods, and you can make it. You can make it all very fluffy and this is a great. It's a great learning opportunity. These other nations don't have the capacity to hold these items. So this is what I really feel. I feel that these are stolen goods. They should be returned. And perhaps one of the first things that should be returned is the ruby, which King Charles wears, which clearly belongs to India.
Right. You've covered a lot of ground there. Tiffany, have a go back at him.
Okay, well, obviously, I do disagree with you. I mean,
talk to each other.
Mm-hmm. I disagree that they are. They're not stolen. So you might think it's a moral outrage, and you might think the British Museum is wrong to hold them, and you might. Yeah,
sure. When you say they're not, sorry, Tiffany. When you say they're not stolen, were these items given to the British? Please take these goods.
In many cases,
please take these from our nation.
In many cases, they were bought or they were donated. So yes.
I think you're living in cloud cuckoo land, Tiffany. Really. I think you're living in cloud cuckoo land.
She's quite an expert on this subject, Shazad.
Yeah, she's an expert, but she's looking at it from her perspective because she's clearly got a love for the museums. I can understand that. But it goes back to my point, which is that that nobody gave these things to the British. They were stolen.
I think you're wrong on the specifics, but I understand that people feel very strongly about the British Museum being a symbol of, in many cases, British imperialism, British domination. I think that's to put the cart before the horse, if you like. I think sometimes museums become a greater symbol of these things than they actually are. They're more a consequence, and sometimes in terms of history, more a consequence of these things. They didn't cause them.
Quite clearly, there's a lot of nuance to this. And I've kept it quite sort of certainly simplified things. But the crux of the matter is that what I feel, and I'm pretty sure hundreds of millions of people around the world certainly feel this way, that when they come and visit London and they see these items, whether it be things that have taken from the Chinese, from China, like the Han Dynasty, or rubies that were taken out of India, a whole host of items that are of great significance
But Shahzad, sorry, if I may, with all due respect, I mean, I do think that there are some pieces that are extremely morally problematic in the British Museum and certain other Western museums. But on the whole, these museums acquired pieces lawfully at the time under the laws of the particular countries where these pieces were acquired. I mean, a lot of cases, these were excavated with the permits from the relevant authorities. I mean, whether it was Egypt or India or China. So I think that I think the nuance is important here, because if we start saying that all 8 million items in the British Museum were stolen, were nicked, including all those pieces that came from British soil, I mean, that starts to look a little bit extreme, and I think that might undermine the more valid arguments for, you know, the Greeks and the Parthenon marbles, maybe the Nigerians and the Benin bronzes, the Koh-i-Noor diamonds, others. So I think we need a bit. I think we need a bit of nuance here. We can't start saying everything has been stolen, because then that, you know, it paints the other side into a corner, and then you're not able to get anything back at that point.
Sure, but when you say everything hasn't been stolen, you're implying then that some things were certainly stolen. So perhaps it would make sense to return the things that were stolen and leave the things that were, as you're saying, lawfully obtained.
Yeah, maybe in a crude way. I think it relates more to the morality of it. In some cases, things that were taken in times of war and armed conflict, for example, I think those are quite ethically problematic, even if they might have been taken legally at the time. I think that those are the kinds of pieces we should be focusing on. That includes the Benin bronzes and the Magdala treasure and a few others that are at the British Museum. So I think that's really where the debate should be had. The British Museum is a wonderful institution. I mean, I'm a card-carrying member. I love the British Museum. I spend a lot of time there. But there are parts of it that I think are ethically troubling, not just for me and others, but for many people who come and visit. And I think it's right, actually, that the BM is now taking this forward and trying to negotiate some kind of workable settlement with the Greeks.
Are there similar arguments in the United States, for example, in the Smithsonian? I mean, are there exhibits there that maybe were taken, in inverted commas, from Indian reservations, for example, that they would actually quite like back in their own museums?
Yeah, there are. And they actually have a law. So it's quite different than it is here. In the U.S., they have a national law that requires museums to make full inventories of everything that they have that might have come from a Native American tribe and to repatriate a lot lot. So that's something they've been doing for a while.
Very politically incorrect there, didn't I?
Well, let's not go there.
Let's not. Right, let's move on to another call. It's from Illy in Waterloo. Illy, hi.
So I can hear you. Can you put the volume up?
Well, I can't put my volume up.
Hi, sorry. Good evening to you all. I wanted to ask you in the panel, what's interesting is, as Ottoman Empire was in charge of Greece at that time, Corfu was part of Albania land, and so...
I think we've lost Illy there. I don't know what point he was about to make.
It's a real cliffhanger, that one.
It really was. Let's see. We'll see if we can get him back in a few moments' time. A text here: as a Greek living in the UK, I'm outraged at comments from your panel guests. The very language you're having this discussion in is partially derived from the Greek language. When the marbles were taken, Greece was under occupation against its will. The panel claims the Greek state didn't exist at the time the marbles were taken, and they're attempting to differentiate the ancient Greeks from the modern Greeks. However, this is far from reality. The modern Greek language is only slightly different from the ancient Greek language. Greeks still practice many traditions and foods from the ancient origins. The Greek culture survived 400 years of persecution and attempted eradication. The marbles were sold as a symbol of the eradication of the Greek culture and should most definitely be returned. Tiffany?
I would disagree with that. I think one of the most interesting things about our image of the Acropolis today is that it's a 19th century construction. So when the marbles arrived in Britain and when Greece became a state, there was an attempt to revive Athens as it was thought to have been. So what they did in Athens and on top of the Acropolis was take everything modern down Equally, in Britain, there was a debate over the value and the aesthetics of the marbles. And what you had was a shift in taste away from a sort of Roman to Greek taste. And that was projected to the world. So the very idea we have of the image of Athens as 2,500 years ago is a 19th century construction that happened both when Greece was formed as a state and from the British Museum with the marbles.
Okay, well, we have a full switchboard of calls, so we're going to get through as many of them as we can.
Can I just add something to that?
You can't, because I've got to go to the news, but you can do in just a couple of minutes' time. It's 8:30 on LBC. We're talking about the return of historical artefacts. Should that be a given? Or should each artefact have its merits debated? That's what we're doing over the course of the next half an hour. It's 8:31. Daryl Jackson has the news headlines.
Sir Keir Starmer has accused the Prime Minister of dither and delay after he suggested there wouldn't be a May election. Rishi Sunak says he's working towards there being a vote in the second half of the year. An elderly woman has died in Oxfordshire after crashing into a falling tree while driving. Thames Valley Police has referred itself to the watchdog after it was reported to them around 90 minutes earlier. And the Islamic State group is claiming it was behind an attack in Iran involving 2 suicide bombers who murdered dozens of people. It happened at a commemoration for an Iranian general killed in a US drone strike in 2020. LBC weather: heavy rain in southern and southeastern parts of England tonight. Rain at times for Scotland, but drier elsewhere, and a low of 0.
This is LBC. Iain Dale. Text 84850. This is LBC.
8:34 on LBC. With us in the studio talking about the possible return of artefacts to their country of origin are Alexander Herman and Tiffany Jenkins. I could plug their books a little bit later again. Now let's take a couple of texts before we come to the calls again. No name on this one. The comments about culture moving are hysterical. Okay. They're describing the very process that is desired and the medium of how it will happen. Statues are moved all the time. It becomes part of their story. Plus, restitution from museums in the UK has been happening for around 100 years on request of the original owners and including human remains. didn't know that. Tiffany, is that right? This has been going on for many years because we think of this as a relatively recent phenomenon.
Oh, it's been going on for hundreds of years. In fact, in terms of human remains, that's a more recent development. But what you had is institutions repatriating to Native American groups, to Aboriginals, to people in New Zealand. They went from being sort of objects that were considered as evidence to objects that were considered ancestors. And it was very much a reckoning with the past, a sort of point I was trying to make earlier, that there's a sort of sense that we need to come to terms with the past, and that's a much more recent development. But it is rushing through institutions. The human remains thing is also quite interesting because some of this material does tell us very much about the past. It tells us about who lived where, when, population movement, how people lived, what they ate. And so the consequence of them leaving institutions to go back to ancestor communities, to go back to their present-day communities, is that evidence is gone. So there is sort of it's not like the repatriation of objects, which will go back to a museum probably, in most cases, in the case of the Parthenon. In this case, the evidence now is destroyed.
Neil says, can we take a look at the contents of Swiss vaults to see how much illegal booty is stuffed away? I'll guess not. Too many billionaires who hold too much power to allow that. Well, that would be up to the Swiss to decide, wouldn't it, Alexander?
Yeah, I don't know quite what to say about that. One thing interesting about Switzerland, they seem to be moving in this same direction, pro-restitution. They recently announced that they're going to be setting up a new panel that will deal with Nazi-looted art in Swiss collections and colonial-era material in Swiss collections. So the Swiss have kind of gotten on board in this discussion.
Right, let's go to Mike. Sorry, got a bit of a cold. Mike in Enfield. Hello, Mike.
Hi there. I should imagine that the British Museum should be accepted as an international body which looks after all these wonderful artifacts and start returning them to the countries, many of which are run by dictators who would use whatever assets they have for their own use, either putting it in their homes or just selling it. What I'm afraid of is that wherever it goes, is there any guarantee that it's going to remain there and be looked after? That is the problem.
Tiffany?
Well, in the case of the Parthenon marbles, the Elgin Marbles, if they were to go back to the Acropolis Museum, then they'd be very well looked after. So there's no problem there. It's more a question of where is best for the artefact. I think there are questions, though, about the Benin bronzes, and there's a move to move them from museums in Britain, Europe, as well as America. But at the moment, were they to go back to Nigeria, and there is a sort of power struggle within Nigeria about who would get them. And at the moment, they would go to the king, so they wouldn't go to a museum. Therefore, there are certainly questions there.
But Nigeria
copies and send them, make copies and send them there. But all these African
I don't
countries,
think that would be acceptable to
dictators every few years.
Oh, come on, Mike. I mean, seriously, if that's the level of your argument,
well,
you're being a complete imperialist. We're British.
There's so many countries there. Look what's happening in South Africa.
So we're British. We know better, do we?
Well, we've been a democratic country for over 500 years, and these countries. I mean, look what's happening in South Africa. Look what's happening in Sudan, Eritrea. Look what's happening in Nigeria.
Mike, if I may, there was a big scandal that was revealed this summer that there had been over 2,000 pieces stolen by a curator at the British Museum from the British Museum's collection. So I think you have to be a bit careful when you use those arguments.
Fault. All these CEOs just don't bother. They're just put there and they don't even find out what's going on. That's the problem. We're not appointing the correct officials to look after our goods.
Right. Okay. You haven't answered his point at all. You're basically just an old-fashioned imperialist, Mike, aren't you?
Not really. Not when I see what happens in the world and who takes over what countries and what's really going on underneath.
But, I mean, the thing is, if anything is going to be repatriated, I mean, it's going to be highly documented. Everything's going to be digitized. So the idea that some corrupt leader is going to sell these things on the black market, I mean, nobody would buy that. You can't buy it. I mean, that argument, I think, is a little bit far-fetched, with all due respect, Mike.
Right, let's go to Ben in Wembley. Hello, Ben.
I'll get straight to my point, is that basically if I take something from a shop that's considered a theft, I can say, well, I'm going to look after it much better than your shop will. And they will be laughing at me. Obviously, that's a theft. Anything that is stolen and is proven to be stolen from others has to be returned. If they...
I think we've lost Ben there.
Everything. Well, like Israel has to return the land to the Palestinians.
We did that last night. We're not doing that again tonight, Ben. But the point is, as we've heard from both of our guests, these marbles were not stolen in the conventional sense of the word.
I mean, they were taken in morally problematic ways, which we would now consider to be ethically vexing. I think most people would.
That's a good phrase. I'll steal that.
Ethically vexing. Yeah, that's a good one, isn't it? But I think that needs to be. So there's a volatility of holding on to something that you know was taken in a way that today we would consider morally troubling. I do think that's the case, even if it wasn't quote unquote stolen at the time. So I think we do need to appreciate that nuance between stolen and taken in a way that we consider unethical.
Right, let's move on to Isa in Greenock in the west of Scotland. Isa, hi.
Hello, hi. I'm Isa. I'm from Nigeria, and I heard you discussing about artifacts from Nigeria.
Yes, we did.
So, well, my contribution is when you're a country that don't have a lot of problem to talk about, you start talking about museums and artifacts. Like Nigeria, we have a lot more problems to face. Economic issues and security, the two major issues I want to discuss about. So you're talking about artifacts. That's something that's happened like decades ago. We're talking about right now what's going on. I'll give you an example. Just recently, the Central Bank Governor of Nigeria there's an investigation going on. He had like £500 million seen in one of the United Britain banks on fixed deposit. So that's more important to us than the artifacts, because if that kind of corruption is discouraged by the leading Western countries, I think that will make a big difference, because these are funds that are meant to be used for development of infrastructures.
No, look, I get this. I mean, so with respect, you're going slightly off the subject that we're talking about. What you're talking about is very important, but I'm sure there are many people in Nigeria who do think that the Benin bronzes should be returned to the country. Do you not?
So what's more important? £500 million. I could remember just last week, the scandal on PPE is just £60 million. I could feel the rage from people. The issue of Margaret is like 10 times compared to the Nigerian economy. £500 billion is like everything to us.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, compared to the UK economy,
I get that,
like
but
nothing.
we're not talking about that tonight, I'm afraid. I mean, it may be that we do a phone-in on Nigerian corruption at some point, but then no doubt be accused of being imperialist on that too. So we'll leave that there if we may. Let's go to Jerry, who is in St Albans. Hello, Jerry.
Hi. How are you, Ian?
I'm very well, sort of very well, but coughing my guts up, frankly. What would you like? I apologise for all of the coughing that there's been in this hour. But normally I can press a cough button, but not when there are other people in the studio with me, because it silences them too. What would you like to say?
Well, you know what? We haven't stolen anything. If we're starting on that subject that all museums have stolen things, yeah, that means every museum in the whole world are thieves. And we're not. We look after what we have in the museums, not just in the UK, but across the world. And, why we didn't steal them. And why has this come about now? Why do they want them back now?
Well, they've always wanted them back.
Yes, but why make such a big thing of it now? They may always have wanted them back, but Why is
okay?
it
Well,
so
let's put that to our panel. Well, I mean, is there any difference? I mean, because obviously the Greek Prime Minister, when he was over here a few weeks ago, clearly wanted to raise it with the Prime Minister, who didn't want to talk about it. And but there have been some friendly discussions between the British Museum and the Greeks in recent months, as far as I understand it. What is there anything in Greece that's happening that we should know about?
Well, I mean, there is a relationship that's been building between the two museums, the Acropolis Museum and the British Museum. The British Museum just lent one of its great pieces, the Midias Hydria, to the Acropolis Museum, which is a good sign. It means that relationship is starting. And I think that if they can build a relationship of mutual trust, then they might be able to do more than just a single piece going back. But I think they're working in the right direction when it comes to loans and to arrangements of that sort. And so I think that's maybe part of it. But just to go back to Jerry's point, I mean, the Greeks, to a certain extent, have been officially claiming back the Parthenon marbles at least since the 1980s, when they made it an official diplomatic claim in 1983. But you could say there have been debates about this going back almost to the time that Lord Elgin's men took these pieces from the Acropolis in the first place. So I think there's been, at least when it comes to the Parthenon marbles, this has been an issue at the top of the cultural, even political agenda for a long time. So it's not some kind of new development.
Someone here says, OMG, is Indiana Jones a thief? It's 8:46.
LBC. Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
It is 8:48. Our two guests in the studio with me talking about the return of historical artefacts are Alexander Herman and Tiffany Jenkins. Alexander's book is called The Parthenon Marbles Dispute, and Tiffany's book is called Keeping Their Marbles. Let's go to Dieter in Islington. Hi, Dieter.
Good evening. It's Peter, not Dieter, but never mind.
Doing very well this evening, aren't I?
Well, that's okay. I forgive you. Two things I'd like to mention. I'd like to point out. First of all, when Elgin was in Greece, he decided to take the marbles away. It wasn't just on a whim. He actually saw Turkish soldiers using the marbles for target practice. He said one Turkish soldier was trying to shoot the nose off one of the statues, and which is one of the reasons why he decided to have them removed. And of course, then archaeology was a very hit and miss, not the exact science it is now, which is one of the reasons why he did remove them and had them brought back to England. So he's not quite the villain that some people can make him out to be. Secondly,
can I just jump in there? Actually, sure. Elgin wasn't on the ground in Athens until about 9 months after the pieces started to be removed. So I know he, after the fact, tried to claim that there were arguments of that nature that would justify the removal. He wasn't actually there. So I would question that anecdote that you led us with.
Maybe he wasn't there, but maybe he did actually see, or somebody reported back to him what was actually happening. And of course, at the time, people like Byron and Shelley were pro-Greek independence, as we know. They tried to support the Greek independence movement. I think probably Elgin. The guy's been dead for over 200 years, so we can't try and explain all his motivations. But I think partly he wanted to protect the marbles from being destroyed, which they would have been if they would have been kept in Greece.
I think that's it's a counterfactual, isn't it? What would have happened? And I think even in Tiffany, in your book, you talk about it's hard to know what would have happened if Elgin and his men hadn't done what they did. I think there are arguments on both sides. There are pieces in Athens that Elgin didn't take that are in better shape than the ones at the British Museum, and there are pieces in Athens that are in worse shape. So I don't think it's a convincing argument.
And how big are these things?
They're huge.
So if 90,
they were
heavy.
90 very large, heavy, I think 2 tons or so each piece. It took 10 years, basically, to remove them from Greek shores.
But even sending them back now, that would not be an easy logistical exercise, would it?
It wouldn't. It would also put them at risk. And so if they were to go to Greece, they should probably stay, because I don't think you should be ferrying these things back and forth.
Tiffany Jenkins, are you saying that they should go back to Greece and they should stay on live radio?
Oh, no. I take it back. But Peter's point, the caller's point, is actually an important one. The details may not have been quite right, but this was a ruin. It was being used as a garrison. People were taking things off. So Elgin's men got it just at the point before it became this kind of valued artefact. It wasn't before then.
Right, let's move on to Manolis, who's in Stanmore. Good evening, Manolis. What would you like to say?
Yes, hi, Ian. I just finished a clinic and I tuned into your lovely show. I think everybody's got some valid points. I'm a Greek by heritage. I was not born in Greece. I was born in South Africa.
I thought I detected a South African accent there.
Exactly. I've been in the UK for 27 years. I love the country. I'm a consultant surgeon here, and I love the British Museum. It's an amazing place. But I do have 1 or 2 points which I didn't listen to the whole conversation, but 1 or 2 points I'd like to make as somebody that's both Greek and British, South African. So probably I'm third generation Greek living outside of Greece. I'm not a Christian. I'm actually Hellenic in religion. So those people amongst the panel and elsewhere that feel that Hellenism somehow died, it didn't. Even through Turkish times, there were several hundred, if perhaps thousands of us that believed in our ancestral religion. So those temples that we just see as artifacts or something that sits in a British museum are actually very live for tens of thousands of Greeks today that have actually reclaimed their Hellenic heritage away from Christianity. Not that I've got a problem with Christianity. I respect it deeply. My mother's a Christian and so forth. But I worship those, what you see as a British, as something in a museum that simply sits there and people can come and glory. It would be the equivalent of somebody coming and taking from the Vatican today, let's say if it was under occupation, and remember that Greece at the time was under Turkish Ottoman occupation. We never signed up to be under their occupation. And anybody that comes around and says that we've got no continuity with our past, I would like to remind them that we're probably the only autochthonous people in Europe who have the longest continuous history in the whole of Europe, the longest continuous spoken language on this planet. that our language written today in English, those so-called Latin characters, are Greek. And so when I hear phrases such as, well, why should we return them? First of all, I'm not certain that they should be returned simply for the sake of being returned, but I think the idea that these marbles were taken from a temple and brought over, and today we must sort of look at it as oh, well, you know, it's just at the time there was no Greece, there were no Greeks. What are you on about? At the time there were millions of us. There were probably 9 million Greeks back then. We're still 9 million people because of the genocides that were committed in Anatolia and the rest of it. So it gets me a little bit emotional to hear about this, these marbles, that, first of all, they shouldn't be called Elgin. The term should be, it's complete cultural misappropriation. Elgin didn't make them. He didn't pay for them. They're not his property. And in fact, these were not pieces of marble that were sitting on the floor neglected. These were ripped off the temple and taken away. And there are historical records of Greeks at the time decrying the whole episode, but they couldn't do anything about it.
Let me just put that point to Tiffany and Alexander. Is that right, what Manolis has just said, that at the time this happened, there were lots of people in Greece who were very unhappy about it?
Well, I think there is some evidence of travellers who'd spoken to local people, but I think largely there was no clear protest when these pieces were being taken. And actually that was dealt with by a select committee of the House of Commons here in 1816. That was actually one of the reasons why they thought Elgin probably did obtain legal permission, that nothing was done over the many years that they were taken away. I don't necessarily agree with that point, but it was something that was looked at the time. So I think there are arguments to say that there were and that there weren't.
Niall says, good grief, we're talking about lumps of stone when people are dying in wars around the world. People, get real. It's called light and shade, Neil. We talk about war quite a lot. In fact, we had an hour on it last night. You can't talk about war all the time. Light and shade, that's what I try and bring on this programme. Raj is in Manchester. Hello, Raj.
Hi there, Ian. The point I was just wanting to make was slightly different, but your previous caller, I think he pretty much hit the nail on the head, that they were a religious type of item, and that's why they should go back to where they were originally produced, etc. But the thing, my original point was going to be sort of twofold. One, they were produced in Greece, so that's where they should be returned. That's where they should be forever. And number two, there's another section to this, like that, the marbles I hear, that do not only form part of the whole statues or how it was set. So there's part of it still is in Greece, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, so they were produced there. Half of it is still there as well. So I understand that logistically it would be difficult to send them back and without causing any damage, etc. But surely that should be it in a nutshell.
Okay. All right, Raj, thank you. Let's finish off with Peter in Haringey. Hello, Peter.
Hello, Ian. How come you've got foreigners on your panel trying to interfere in our history?
Alexander, how dare you?
And you've got Ian, you're an apologist for all this.
Oh, am I?
Questioning what's happened over hundreds of years ago when these items were legitimately obtained.
Well, that's the point of this hour, to try and test out whether that was the case. And the foreigner that you referred to is a learned academic on these issues and knows what he's talking about, and he's very welcome.
Yeah, and he's living and working in this country, I assume, and now undermining it. He's using.
How is he undermining it? For goodness sake! Okay, Alexander, defend yourself.
Well, thank you for the warm welcome. I'm glad this is the last caller, not the first.
Is that all?
Well, I don't know what can I say to that.
Well, I'm not sure what you can say, but anyway, Peter, interesting point of view. Listen, thank you both very much. I think you get an extra plug for your book after that call.
The whole
Alexander.
title, I think, this time.
I think the whole title. Actually, it's yours that's got the longest title, isn't it? The Parthenon Marbles Dispute, Heritage, Law, Politics by Alexander Herman, and Tiffany Jenkins, Keeping Their Marbles, How the Treasures of the Past ended up in museums and why they should stay there. Well, I've really enjoyed the last hour. Thank you both very much indeed. Rishi from Longhurst text, I switched on and thought, oh no, the Elgin Marbles again. How wrong I was. 2 fascinating guests. Brilliant. Note the 2 fascinating guests, Alexander, just to compensate for the last call. Right, coming up in the next hour, we are going to turn our attention to the junior doctors dispute. I did say light and shade, didn't I? Now, I was appalled when I read this today, but NHS bosses have made more than 20 requests for striking junior doctors in England to be allowed to cross the picket line to help out services. None of the requests made on the first strike day were granted by the British Medical